Capcom first struck a chord with players during the home console heyday of the 80s and the 90s. Franchises like Mega Man and the likes of Aladdin and DuckTales established this dedicated player base and allowed Capcom to then expand into bigger franchises like Street Fighter and Resident Evil. Capcom built their reputation on these big franchises and rode that wave of momentum into the PlayStation 2 era, with Devil May Cry and more experimental outings like Okami and Killer 7. The GameCube then played host to the still beloved Resident Evil 4, the Xbox had Onimusha, and the ultimately doomed Dreamcast was then the go-to spot for authentic arcade fighters. Partnerships were key in this era, and Capcom built themselves an empire using collaboration and savvy thinking. This was not to last. While the next console generation certainly started off well with the genre-redefining Street Fighter 4, Capcom quickly lost the plot. Street Fighter 4 receiving updates in the form of multiple physical releases baffled fans and prompted an ill-fated steer into the land of DLC. There's nothing inherently wrong with DLC, of course, but Capcom's strategy was dreadful. Many fans thought Asura's Wrath didn't end properly because the game was actually gunning for a sequel. No, Capcom actually just wanted to sell the true ending for $7. They then later became a major antagonist of the on-disc DLC debate when it actually emerged that roughly 30% of Street Fighter X Tekken's roster was on the disc but locked behind a paywall. They did see some success during this period, to be fair, but games like Dead Rising and Dragon's Dogma were not enough to fix the damage. Resident Evil ditching survival horror explosions in 5 and 6, and Dante's unwanted haircut in DMC Devil May Cry did little to get fans back on board. The launch then of the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 brought about what many thought was the end of Capcom's mainstream success. Street Fighter V, releasing with barely any content, was definitely not the way to build on the enduring legacy of its predecessor, and honestly, the less said about Marvel x Capcom Infinite, the better. Then, despite truly huge sales, the critical and public reception to Resident Evil 6 had all but killed the franchise. For a while, all seemed lost, but almost out of nowhere. Then came games like Devil May Cry 5, Monster Hunter World, Mega Man 11, and Resident Evil 7. Fresh, bold continuations of established franchises that mix new ideas with a proven formula to create a new beast entirely. Remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 showed Capcom's willingness to embrace their history for the benefit of their players, and even Street Fighter V got the updates that it needed to stay relevant and claw back its reputation as a game. Of course, not that all is sunshine and roses with that one. Complacency and misfires were the main reasons for Capcom's initial decline. All that time at the top essentially made them lazy, and some iffy decision-making whittled away their audience's dwindling trust. As we've seen, Capcom fully embracing the shifting monetization practices of the time in search of some easy money, well, that did not leave fans impressed. An over-reliance and outsourcing then diluted the traditionally Japanese sensibilities the company was known for, and overall began to just erode their global appeal. A gradual slide in quality for some of their core franchises was essentially a death knell. The controversial and shockingly lackluster Resident Evil 5 gave way to the muddled Resident Evil 6. Its big sequel status was enough to set series records in terms of sales, but the actual reception at the time was mixed at best. DMC Devil May Cry ended fans of the series' 5-year wait for a new game, but it did so with an unwanted reboot that added nothing to the series and wasted the few good ideas that it had, while Dead Rising experimented with the bold direction of dropping its likable protagonist and personality. That was not a winning move. The funny thing is, by the time that iffy games like Resident Evil 6 and Dead Rising 3 were out in the wild, Capcom's resurgence internally was actually underway. Capcom's big rethink, in fact, began in 2010, when profits dropped a staggering 90%. Ouch. Sluggish sales for games like Lost Planet 2 and Monster Hunter Tri made Capcom pause for a moment and really consider what was going on with their company. But truly, it was the era of the new console generation that came in 2013 that things properly got going. Capcom's financial report that year stressed the need for sweeping change off the back of poor sales and high costs. Revenue was technically still up, so the company wasn't in extreme trouble yet, but drastically reduced sales forecasts meant that the mediocrity could not continue. Capcom's strategy to save itself then involved dialing back on outsourcing to bring more development back home to Japan, hiring new staff to strengthen their internal teams, and enhancing collaboration between marketing and development. Essentially, getting more in sync with their core. An investor report at the time highlighted the, quote, decline in quality of outsourced titles, and Capcom cut their losses by cancelling a lot of in-development projects at those foreign studios. The report lamented the company's delayed response to the changing industry and pledged to put it right. Capcom's resurgence was aided by a few key players at the company, all having the kinds of obvious ideas that tend to be completely missed by the wider industry. COO Haruhito Sugimoto promoted the use of DLC to create lasting appeal for players and ongoing revenue streams for Capcom. But this DLC was, as he said, to be considered from the development stage of the game so as to maximize the value for players. He said that if players don't find DLC to be interesting, then there's no point in even making it in the first place. That without lasting appeal, a game's business success or player enjoyment is merely transient. Sugimoto clearly was a firm believer that only companies that understand the industry and their customers will survive, and he seems to have endeavored to shape Capcom into such a company. Quality and player satisfaction were key. And if they hadn't made good on that, it would just sound like me sitting here parroting corporate puff pieces. But of course, we all know how that panned out. Sugimoto outlined these ambitions way back in 2013, when things externally looked bleak for Capcom. And skipping on a few years, we can all see just how successful this has been. The company's decision to focus on improving quality over chasing big sales is plain to see. And funny enough, improving quality ended up leading to big sales. Speaking shortly after the Resident Evil 2 remake was announced, the European COO said that they would now rather release a game that reviewed well but sold poorly than the other way around. While there was certainly some trepidation internally about revealing RE2make, as we refer to it, Capcom's new commitment to really thinking about what goes into their games meant that they were able to bring all of the best parts of their series together in one package. While it may have been a step back from RE7, things like intelligently reworked gameplay and enhanced Resident Evil 4 style controls meant that RE2make hit a sweet spot of its own. It was developed alongside Resident Evil 7 and used the same engine, showing Capcom's willingness to distribute their resources intelligently and ensuring that Resident Evil 7's return to form wasn't a fluke. But, of course, Resident Evil is just one of their big pillars. Monster Hunter and Devil May Cry are also sitting pretty. Devil May Cry 5 dropped around the same time as Resident Evil 2 Remake, and it was a blistering return for the series. Capcom's introspection was again plain to see with this title, with the game offering fans of the stylish yet punishing combat pretty much exactly what they wanted. Monster Hunter, meanwhile, is an absolute juggernaut. Monster Hunter World is Capcom's highest-selling game ever, at nearly 17 million copies, and the recent Switch exclusive Monster Hunter Rise managed to ship a staggering 5 million copies over its first 2 weeks. The Monster Hunter franchise is perhaps Capcom's biggest success story, As a franchise, it pretty much hit unofficial public holiday levels of popular in Japan, but its popularity in the rest of the world is still growing strong. It's taken a while though. Monster Hunter's traditionally Japanese sensibilities didn't really catch on outside of Japan until Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, released for the 3DS in 2015. Capcom's localization director actually put a lot of effort into making the game as appealing to Western audiences as was possible. Things like tightening up the script, adding tutorials, and pushing the game hard in marketing with a message that could actually land. Capcom then revisited this approach with Monster Hunter World. Realizing that the game's open-world setting would likely appeal to Western audiences, they adopted some more Western-style interface designs and control elements. Western audiences had previously found the franchise to be impenetrable, with its high difficulty curve, little explanation, and unskippable dialogue boxes. So, Capcom listened, and they streamlined that whole experience to make it work for Western expectations. The result, of course, was that Monster Hunter World essentially went supernova. Its Iceborne expansion is currently Capcom's 6th highest selling game, with 7.2 million sales. Staggering stuff. World also, by the way, nabbed Capcom the top spot on Metacritic's list of best publishers in 2018. So as you can see, the bulk of Capcom's resurgence plan was based around returning to its Japanese roots, and the ongoing global success of the very Japanese Monster Hunter franchise, I think, can be viewed as a humongous victory for this strategy. They actually doubled down on what they know people like about their games, they focused on their messaging, such that broad audiences could actually get into their games, and they managed to do that without compromising the heart. And that is an incredible thing, something that many publishers struggle with. So, how are Capcom doing now? Well, as it turns out, pretty damn well. They recently announced their 4th consecutive quarter of record high profits. Net sales were up 17% and operating income grew 51.6% to $317 million in now the 8th consecutive growth year. Regular income was up 52% to $321 million. The report attributes this growth to the ongoing success of the core franchises. Monster Hunter World Iceborne, Resident Evil 2, Devil May Cry 5, they all performed well on next-gen platforms as well. A victory in Capcom's plan to increase product life value. Huge sales for Monster Hunter Rise and a strong initial performance for Resident Evil Village, I believe 3 million sales pretty much off the bat. Well, that prompted a 5% increase in their net sales forecast. Then, looking to the rest of the year, there's Monster Hunter Stories 2 and potentially even a Dragon's Dogma 2. I think their record high profits could be here to stay. And do you know what the lesson here is? It's all about understanding why players like the thing that you make. On doubling down on that, right? Turns out that if you just make good shit that people want, in this case, in IPs that they know, well, it's a surefire way to win. What a surprise. This is the opposite of, to use a completely different example, Electronic Arts doing what they did to Command & Conquer, taking an excellent base-building real-time strategy game and then streamlining the heart out of it to humongous, near-franchise-killing failure. Yeah, I think a lot of the games industry could learn from how Capcom have clawed it back, because they were from roaring to success to crushing failure, and then to roaring success again. Truly a great story. Honestly, there's nothing that makes me more happy than a publisher actually just getting what it deserves for just doing good shit and making people happy. So hats off to Capcom for showing everyone how it's done. I hope you found this to be an interesting listen. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.